A key reason for this collaboration is the increased quality that can be reached both in the application process, however also in the research outputs. Next slide, please. Both ADOs and researchers bring respective qualities to social science research, which when combined adds strength to the application and research process. ADOs bring detailed and multifaceted understanding of anti-doping in a practical context. This depth of understanding can have positive implications for linking the outcomes of your research with practice. ADOs often have good networks and connections with relevant stakeholders, including athletes and support personnel. Some ADOs will also have access to resources for social science research, which can, of course, be beneficial. Researchers, on the other hand, are experienced in the design and implementation of research and do so to a rigorous standard. Researchers bring a wealth of knowledge about previous research and about relevant methodologies that can be used in social science research, as Gretchen has just highlighted for us before. Researchers often have experience in grant application writing as well, which is important in the context of today's webinar. Next slide, please. There are many considerations for effective partnerships in social science research. However, 4 which we'll highlight today include shared understanding between all parties, mutual respect for various parties in the collaboration, commitment to the partnership from the start to the end of the research as well as through dissemination, and adaptability and compromise throughout the research process. Firstly, a shared understanding between the partners is important to clarify and agree on early in the research process, particularly around the areas of the roles and contribution that each will make to the research itself. It's also important to agree on the aim, the research questions, the process, the desired outcome, and the timeframes which you are working. It's also helpful to agree on shared expectations throughout the research process, and it can be really useful to document all of this understanding within a referred to document throughout the process, which captures all factors and can be helpful, particularly if a research project is a longitudinal one. Next slide, please. Mutual respect for each other and the research itself is also key to effective partnerships in social science research. As highlighted earlier, ADOs and researchers both bring respective expertise to the research process, and it's important to understand and acknowledge this throughout. It's also important to clarify and continually communicate about what you each wish to get out of the research and what you can each put in. Like the shared document previously mentioned, it can be helpful to develop an agreed framework for resolving problems in the unlikely event that they occur to ensure that you can continue with a working collaborative relationship following which. Next slide, please. Commitment to the partnership is obviously incredibly important and ideal to establish in step 1 of the research plan, which Gretchen has shared. It's important that this occurs early in the concept phase of research so that each partner is included for the entire journey of research. It is important that this commitment and this partnership is strong from the concept phase right through to completion of the study and through to dissemination of results. This, of course, requires attention and focus, which otherwise can be missed, so it's just an important thing to highlight and remain aware of throughout. Next slide, please. The last consideration for effective partnership that I'll highlight is the ability to be adaptable and compromising. Like anything, research can start out with a very clear plan, but things can change. And when they do, transparent and frequent communication between research partners is essential. It is important at this stage to go back to the shared document that we discussed that outlines the focus and agreed purpose, aims, etc. for the research, and particularly when deadlines may need to be reviewed as a result of the change. Next slide, please. I just want to touch on the importance of involving athletes and athlete support personnel in social science research. It's important to highlight that the inclusion of those affected by your research will add depth to the outcomes of your study and your understanding along the process. Next slide, please. As such, it's encouraged that researchers take an athlete-centered approach. This is likely to have a positive impact on theory to practice upon completion, but it also empowers athletes to have a voice in the development of policies and programs that will affect them and their sporting environment directly. Next slide, please. In line with what Gretchen has told us already about validity, it is important to be mindful that the engagement of athletes and support personnel in the research process helps to increase its validity. It's also helpful in the sense that it increases the relevance of your research as the outcomes will apply to the sporting environment as a result. There may well be other stakeholders important to involve in this process as well, such as sporting federations, school sport organisations, etc. However, an athlete-centred approach is strongly encouraged within the context of social science research and anti-doping. Next slide, please. The last point I want to touch on is around making connections with possible research partners and collaborators in social science research. So a few questions to pose to you, whether you are in an ADO or a research institution or government yourself. It's important to understand who is or who has conducted research in the field of interest. You may already have contacts with them, or they may be within a network of someone that you know. If so, it can be really helpful to reach out to them and in the initial phases of concept for your research, learn more, learn as much as you possibly can about your field of interest. It's important also to just question what research institutions and ADOs are accessible to you. You may already have a good relationship with someone you can reach out to when you are in the concept phase of research. There may also be opportunities for you to build a network or build on the network you already have. This may come by way of conferences, other networking platforms, but these are really useful and valid ways to reach out to the right people who are also interested in research or who can point you in the right direction of others that may be. If it is that you've asked yourself these questions and you do not have too many contacts or know where to start in terms of building a network, it can be really helpful to reach out to other ADOs or researchers that you know who have already done so themselves, or WADA who may be able to assist with others they know are looking for research collaborators also. Thank you. So I will now pass on to Dr. Chen.
Right. Thanks, Gretchen and Cian. Very excellent presentation that set up actually very well about the regional consideration, what we are going to discuss next. Next slide, please. So a few considerations for research projects in Asia that we need to go through. We will go through some conceptual consideration, methodological consideration, and execution consideration. Next slide. So for conceptual consideration, I think Gretchen actually mentioned very well that we probably need to understand the literature very well in order to form a very good research questions that has that is valuable for informing science and practice in anti-doping research. And currently, majority of research evidence for social science research related to anti-doping are primarily from Western developed cultures. So there's supposed to be a genuine need for obtaining data or insight from Asia for testing research findings or theories that are largely developed in Western cultures. What is special about the finding in Asia is because the uniqueness of the languages, culture, and contextual factors in Asia that may actually affect the theoretical concept of that has been developed in Western culture in a number of ways. For example, interpretation or meaning of the concept. For example, the understanding of motivation may be very different, or achievement may be very different between Asia and Western developed nations. And another thing is the saliency of one construct. For example, social norm in an Asian culture may be more important or salient as compared to that in Western culture. We don't know. It needs to be tested. And finally, the processes or sequence of effects. For example, talking about relationship between knowledge and attitude. So knowledge may actually affect attitude, but also vice versa. Would that actually be one way in Asia culture or the other way in a Western culture? Actually, a culture, could that be a factor about the sequence or process of the effects between some of the psychological or behavioral factors related to anti-doping? Next slide. Next. Okay. Another conceptual considerations we can consider when planning your research project for the WADA's application is that a culturally specific or cross-cultural research topic is not a must. It's not a necessary. You are just like any other researchers around the world. Even you are submitting an applications where your institution actually located in an Asia region. It doesn't mean that you have to conduct a cultural specific or cross-cultural research. It is actually very important that we think beyond the replication of research in a different culture. For example, I think Gretchen's discussion about the importance of literature review is very crucial here. We have to be familiar with the existing literature, identify the research gaps, and trying to see if your proposed research project may advance the theoretical knowledge, regardless of whether it is going to conduct in a different culture with a different sampling characteristics. You may actually already contribute to new scientific knowledge, even without saying that you are actually trying to collect your sample in a region that no previous research has ever done so. Another thing that you may consider is to enhance the level of evidence in your research. Actually, yeah, there are different level of the evidence that research can provide, even for quantitative research. For example, the most basic one may be just case study, single case study, and then more better level of evidence would be cross-sectional study, and then followed by a prospective study, and then longitudinal study, and maybe quasi-experiment and a randomized control trial. Yeah, so I'm just saying that a different level of evidence may actually give you a more clear or valid picture of how strong some of the psychological or behavioral factors would be on for athletes' behavior on anti-doping or doping. Yeah, so it makes a big difference. Next slide, please. Another conceptual consideration is that if you determine the proposed project is culturally specific or involve cross-cultural elements, you may have to determine if the data collection should be done in a single or multiple cultural regions. And more importantly, in your research proposal, you may actually explain the rationales or core values of collecting data from either a single or multicultural regions. Are there any cultural or geographical specific phenomena? For example, like the use of Chinese medicine, obviously more common in an Asia culture as compared to Western culture. So I'm just saying an example. It might not be the one that you observe. There are actually many other culturally or geographically specific phenomena that are worthy for you to explore. So another explanation you should provide is, are there any theoretical or practical implication for examining the cultural differences? Yeah, this is actually important to clarify in your proposal. Next slide, please. So we went through some of the conceptual considerations. So now it's time for going through some methodological consideration. One thing that I observe when I actually conduct some of the research in Hong Kong and also in Australia is that we actually can't assume that participants in that particular geographical region always belong to the same culture. For example, Hong Kong, Australia, they have a very multicultural population. So athletes are not always belongs to one culture. So in Hong Kong, athletes are not always Chinese. So if your research question examine what's the Chinese culture, and then you try to collect data from Hong Kong, you may have to make special like consideration or assessment about the cultural group of your participants before you actually conduct the study. Okay. And another thing, observation in Asia is that athletes are more commonly trained in sports centers or sports school. Like in China, sports school are very common, and they are quite centrally trained. The implication is that the recruitment of participants might be a little bit easier because they are all centrally located in their training venue. But there are also the downside is that when you are actually doing some experiments and testing some intervention or treatment effects on athletes, you're trying to randomize them into groups and then assign them different treatments. If you're collecting data from some centralized sports facilities, the chance of the contamination of the treatment effects may be higher than athletes where you just approach them individually, where they train in very different training location. So in this case, contamination of treatment effects would be considerably less. Another thing that the problem of approaching or collecting data from athletes that are trained in a centralized location is that we might have to, in our analysis, controlling the effects of groups or clusters, because when they are training in the same or similar sporting environments, it is likely that they might be influenced by some similar contextual or environmental factors. For example, they are sharing the same coaching team, or they are actually interact with same cohort of athletes or sporting personnel. So these effects could have been controlled in your findings using some statistical methods. For example, multi-level modeling would be one way to go. Next slide, please. Okay, I think Gretchen also mentioned in very first place in her slide when talking about research methods is the reliability and validity. So making or testing your athletes using some standard tools in Asia has no exception. But one challenge is that the language of the participants might not necessarily be English, where you can find most well-developed or validated questionnaire or scales. They are actually primarily available in English language. So when you are using these tools in an Asia culture, you might have to actually translate to the language of the participant. You might have to take special consideration of whether there is a translated version already available and validated before. What is the actually the indices of the validity and reliability? So if it is not available, so you might have to carry out a formal translate and back translate procedure to make sure that the language and interpretation of the content of the assessment tool are consistent between the original version and the translated version. You might even take a further step in further validating the translated version in before you actually use the scale for your main research. And in your analysis, you might, if your research question actually look into culturally specific research question, you might have to actually consider culture as one of the variables, like control variables or independent variables in your analysis. It is particularly true when you are testing hypotheses that compare the cultural difference. Next, some of the methodological consideration. Now it comes to the final topic is about execution consideration. We actually talk about participants in our methodological consideration, but actually in terms of the execution, access of the participants is one important issue. So in an Asian culture, apart from obtaining ethical approval from your own research institution, you might have to actually obtain additional approval from the sporting authority or anti-doping authority. And sometimes special arrangement must be discussed and arranged for things like ethics and data storage and processing and ownership. It is because in, for example, in Hong Kong, in some institution, for example, where they have public hospital ethical approval procedure. So which the institutional review board is actually governed by the government. They actually may put some clause in your consent form or ethical procedure that the ownership of the data has to be shared by the government, or but actually this might create some sensitive issues when it comes to research such as anti-doping, because for some athletes or the local anti-doping organization, they might actually question about how you are processing the data of doping and what are the consequences of actually reporting, for example, positive intention of doping or even actual behavior of doping. What if in your research actually find out these incidents? Would you share the data with my sporting organization or even the government? That's one of the main concerns they have, and often it will come to you when you are trying to obtain approval from the local authority for accessing their athletes participants. So it comes to the next point I would like to say. You might have to think about the conflict resolution when this situation come. You might have to prepare a good script or different solution that may resolve the problem or challenges from these organizations when they ask questions about how you handle the data. Would there be any legal issue or actually sensitive issues or ethical issues? So prepare for this before they come, then it's always better. And finally, you might also need to consider the social impact of your research. Even if your research project only is about completing a survey for example, several times, or conducting an interview, it already in some extent influence the athletes or your participants in some way. That's what we commonly call the mere measurement effect in psychology term. So if we keep measuring something, for example, we're measuring the intention of athletes on doping, we actually may change the awareness or even behavior of the targets. So how we can actually take special consideration about this measurement effect, and how the society may react or respond to your study is something you may need to think about before you execute the project. Yep, I think next slide. Yep. So another execution consideration when you're trying to conduct cross-cultural project is that you should try to involve co-investigators who may oversee or implement the data collection in regions different from the principal investigator. For example, like me, if my institution is from Hong Kong, if I would like to collect data from Australia or in UK, I probably would look at whether I can have a co-investigators or collaborators of the project from these regions to make sure that I get insights from about how I can execute my project or collect data from that region. You might have to investigate if there are alternative ways of accessing cross-cultural data for better cost effectiveness, response rate, or as a contingency plan. For example, the pandemic right now is actually have a lot of impact on data collection. A lot of research projects are actually suspended or slowed down by the pandemic. Are there any contingency plan for dealing with this situation? For example, if your interview was supposed to conduct by face-to-face medium, would you have alternative plan on, for example, can we use other video conferencing to conduct the interview? This needs to be considered. So another thing that's about cross-cultural project is whether you would like to employ the research staff. If there's any research personnel that you plan to recruit out of the project, would you recruit that personnel in one site or in multiple sites? For example, one in Hong Kong, another one in Australia. But bear in mind that the project cost might vary a lot because the staff costs in different countries or regions in Asia or other Western countries may have a lot of difference.